thank you all for coming out. I got a clock on the wall, so I'll get you out of here on time. I want to say again, thank you. Yeah, my wife pointed up here. If you haven't taken this survey, take it real quick. It's real fast, real easy. I don't know how surveys work, but she does, and she said it works. And we're just going to kind of gather some info on what you think about who should be on the fifth face on Mount Rushmore. I want to thank my wife Mary for coming here. Everything like this I do in my life, I couldn't do it without her. She's fabulous. And her father came along tonight also, so thank you guys for coming and helping. We're going to talk about the elusive fifth face on Mount Rushmore. That's the title of my talk. At the very end, we'll talk about whether or not that's even possible, but we're just having fun here tonight, okay? So if you guys are history students, you're all real smart. If I make a mistake, give me some grace. If it's a really bad mistake, raise your hand and point it out, okay? Has anyone here been to Mount Rushmore? If you have, raise your hand. Okay, we got a few that have been there. Yeah, it's unbelievable. It may be I'm going to mess with these all night, so they're as annoying to me as they are to you, but just bear with me. It may be my favorite place in the United States. I've probably been there 10 times. Absolutely love it. It is grandiose. It is unforgettable. It is truly an American icon. It's an American iconic image. You see it everywhere. You see it on postcards. You see it in TV ads. You see it in Chevrolet ads, right? Everywhere. The four faces on Mount Rushmore. And those four presidents were etched there for a very important reason, because at the time Mount Rushmore was passed, the legislation was passed to do the carvings, they were viewed as the four most significant presidents of our nation's history. The purpose of Mount Rushmore was the establishment of a memorial commemorative of our national history and progress. And let me tell you, this is one time where Congress passed legislation that was an amazing success. It is a fabulous place to visit. Millions, literally millions of people go there every year to see this. And if you ever get the chance, please do it, because it's worth the drive. You could probably do it in a spring break week if you wanted to, and it'd be worth it. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to examine the impact of these four presidents who are enshrined on Mount Rushmore, and consider whether or not anyone is deserving of being put up there as a fifth face on Mount Rushmore. The reasons for the original presidents being put up were because they were men who exemplified three things: the foundation, the expansion, and the preservation of our republic. And if you think about who they are and their roles, it's easy to see why that would be. Foundation was the first thing. Well, you don't get more foundational than George Washington, right? He's still today referred to as the father of our country. We may not have a United States of America if it weren't for George Washington. So if you want to put someone who's important to the foundation of our nation, that would be him. Second person in the same category is Thomas Jefferson. He was very significant in delineating the philosophical basis for our nation. And Jefferson was significant in founding, but also the second point was expansion. As we'll talk about later, the Louisiana Purchase was under Jefferson, right? Doubled the size of the United States. The preservation of our Union, Abraham Lincoln, the Union was divided in 1861. We were split apart. He saved it. He preserved that Union. So rightfully so, Lincoln should be up there. And the expansion, you might ask, well, where does that leave Teddy Roosevelt? Well, again, expansion. And if you think about what Roosevelt accomplished, which we'll talk about in a minute, he expanded the role of the federal government. He expanded the role of the United States in international affairs, and was incredibly significant to the history of our nation. He was also a very populist president and an extraordinarily popular president. So let's talk about these four men individually. George Washington. He was the first president of the United States, served from 1789 to 1797. Interestingly enough, George Washington did not have a political party. And in fact, he thought political parties should be discouraged and thought that they would be the ruin of our nation. Does anybody out here think he might have been prophetic on that? Okay, yeah, he was. He was, if you think about it, as our first president, there was no government. You know, today when we have a new president elected, he picks out his cabinet and makes key appointments. Well, there was no cabinet before George Washington. He had to do that. He had to set up and establish our government bureaucracy. Because the job of the president is, as the executive branch, to run the government. So he had to set that all up. What an important task that was. He established Washington, D.C. as our capital. We kind of wandered around. I think it might first New York and then Philadelphia, and we ended up in Washington because of George Washington. Interestingly enough about Washington, you know, everybody knows the Electoral College, right? You're all history majors, you know all this. He was the only president who was ever elected unanimously by the Electoral College. And both times he was. He received 100% of the Electoral College votes. Pretty amazing. You think that'll ever happen today? I don't think so. Actually, there's one other president who should have received a unanimous vote but didn't. Anybody know who that might be? If you do, you are a genius. James Monroe. James Monroe, there he is. You're a genius. James Monroe actually, he had no opposition really running against him as president in 1820 and should have received a unanimous Electoral College vote, but he didn't. Why not? Because one elector decided he was going to vote for John Quincy Adams. So, Washington's the only man who ever received unanimous Electoral College vote, but Monroe got robbed. Okay? Washington was also very important for setting a precedent in the history of our nation. After his first term, he really didn't want to run again. But both parties came to him and encouraged him to do so because he was so significant to our nation and to its foundation. So he did. He refused to run for a third term. And that was a precedent that was honored just by tradition until Franklin Roosevelt, who was the only president who's been elected more than 2 terms. So Washington set that precedent. In his personal life, his private life, he was a farmer. He was a tobacco farmer in Virginia, and he was a surveyor. You'll see a lot of things I collect. I collect presidential signatures. And the one thing that I didn't buy that I've regretted ever since is I once had the opportunity to buy, I saw the guy had an original survey signed by George Washington. It was horribly expensive, but I should have taken out a home equity loan and bought it because I've never seen another one. But he was a surveyor. He was the official surveyor of Culpeper County, Virginia. He inherited his land. I said he was a farmer. He inherited approximately 2,500 acres of land and expanded that. And when at the time of his death, he owned over 8,000 acres of land. So he was very successful in his farming business. Second president, Thomas Jefferson. He was president from 1801 to 1809. He was a member of the Democratic Republican Party. Those are people who are really bipolar. Okay, he was the first president with a Republican with a party affiliation. He was also a political philosopher, probably the greatest political philosopher our nation's ever known, and probably the foremost spokesman of democracy of his time. He drafted the Declaration of Independence, which, again, you talk about foundation. You don't get more foundational than that, since that's what caused us to separate from England. He was assisted in that by John Adams, and it was, to some extent, a committee process, but by and large, it was him. And he gets the credit for it. And he he wrote these words, which come as close to being a sacred text in our nation as we have. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We've all heard that. You've all heard that many times. But that is the philosophical basis for our nation. That is the goal we strive for, and we should always strive for as a nation. He wrote the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, which was the basis for our First Amendment. His brilliance is recognized universally. In fact, I'll give you a kind of a fun quote here. John F. Kennedy, who was, of course, a president from 1960 to 61 to 63, was holding a dinner at the White House in 1962. And the dinner was for all the Nobel laureates from North America. So you've got these really smart, really accomplished people having dinner with him at the White House. And here was JFK's quote: "I want to tell you how welcome you are to the White House. I think that this is the most extraordinary collection of talent, of human knowledge that has ever been gathered together at the White House, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone." So, he was a smart guy, okay, Jefferson. He was a great philosopher. Jefferson, during his presidency, made sure that he led the Congress to buy the Louisiana Purchase. Everybody know what the Louisiana Purchase is? Essentially doubled the size of our nation, and includes, by the way, Mount Rushmore. That was part of the Louisiana Purchase. So if one of the reasons for putting these men up there was expansion of our nation, well, you couldn't found somebody better than him for that, because he doubled the size of our nation. He also commissioned the Lewis and Clark expedition. Everybody's heard of Lewis and Clark, right? That was a 2-year expedition. And why is that so important, you might ask? Well, when he bought the Louisiana Territory, it's kind of like you bought a ranch and you never looked at it, okay? Because there was no official survey of it. There was no official mission that had ever been sent out. We knew kind of what was out there, and there would have been explorers who had gone out there, and trappers and whatnot, but nothing that you would base a purchase on. But he got such a great deal, he knew he had to buy it. So he sent Lewis and Clark out there. For 2 years, they went out, came back, and did their report to Congress. A fabulous mission they did, a fabulous exploratory mission. And if you're ever interested, if you want to read a really, really good book on it, I know you guys have a lot of free time, don't have much reading assigned to you here. There's a book called Undaunted Courage by Stephen Ambrose. And if you want to read a book that's just a fabulous read and really interesting about Lewis and Clark, get that one and read it. It's wonderful. Jefferson also established the Library of Congress while he was president. And in the War of 1812, some of you may remember, the British burned down big parts of Washington, including they burned down the Library of Congress. So what do when you lose your library? Well, Jefferson sold his personal library to the country, and that was the basis for the new Library of Congress. Now that tells you a couple things. One, he's very patriotic to do that. And two, the guy had an incredible collection of books, okay, in order to be the basis for the Library of Congress. And if you ever go to Washington, maybe you've all been there, I don't know, do the tour of the Library of Congress. It's unbelievable. It's just the most gorgeous building. Okay, finally, he founded the University of Virginia, in case anyone is a Cavaliers fan here, I don't know, or if you care. Okay, so that's Thomas Jefferson. Lincoln, he was the 16th president, served from 1861 to 1865. He was the very first president elected who was a Republican, first president of the Republican Party. And if you talk about one of the reasons for having these men on Mount Rushmore is that they preserved our republic, no one is more significant than Lincoln, obviously. He when he took over, shortly after he took office, the South seceded from the Union. Southern states seceded. I'm glad you came in with your garb. I love the hat.
Yes.
Sorry to draw attention to you. I think somewhere I saw it said they're going to give an award for the best dressed.
Oh, yeah. Woo! Thank you.
You didn't need to embarrass me.
I came with a black coat pinned up and pretending to be angry just like Thomas Jefferson. He goes, why are you angry? I'm filled with people of my own.
Well, thanks for joining us. Okay, so Lincoln, our nation was divided. He led our nation through the Civil War. He brought our Union back together. He preserved it. Can't overstate the significance of the Emancipation Proclamation. What he did is ended slavery in the United States. Now, this is something that had divided our nation for almost 100 years. From the very time of our foundation, it had divided our nation. It had caused the split in the Union. And ultimately, by signing the Emancipation Proclamation and writing it, he ended slavery. Now that required an amendment to the Constitution. He couldn't do it with just an executive order. Wait, by the way, I'm supposed to be...
Yes.
Sorry.
I made those.
I know you
should
made those.
use them.
I know you did. Okay, so anyway, he did the Emancipation Proclamation. The 13th Amendment, subsequently, he brought it into being. It wasn't passed till after his death, but it was largely instituted because of him. Other things he did while he was president, he passed the Homestead Act. And why was that important? Because you just bought all this land in the Louisiana Purchase and nobody living there, so he allowed people to go out and homestead land and give the land up so you'd settle it. The Homestead Act. He established the Department of Agriculture. Also, Abraham Lincoln was the only president to this day who ever held a patent. Pretty interesting, huh? That's a pretty good accomplishment. Now, actually, it really wasn't ever used much, but he's got a patent from the U.S. Patent Office. So that was pretty wonderful. He is fundamental to our nation. Just can't emphasize that enough. And so then the fourth president, Teddy Roosevelt. He was the 26th president. He served from 1901 to 1909. He also was a Republican. He was the youngest person ever to take the office of the president at age 42. He was the vice president for President McKinley, and in 1901, shortly after his being sworn in for a second term, McKinley was assassinated. And at the time of his assassination, Teddy Roosevelt was off climbing mountains. He was a great outdoorsman. He was off climbing mountains in New York, and they found him and said, "You're president." So at age 42, he became the youngest president ever. Had absolutely, in my opinion, the most amazing life of any president we've ever had. If you like reading about history and you like reading about presidents, there's a 3-volume series by Edmund Morris about Teddy Roosevelt that I know you think 3 volumes, yeah, it will grab you from start to finish. This guy led an amazing life. He supported himself prior to getting into politics largely by writing books. And one of the books he wrote, probably his best known, is the Naval War of 1812, and I've got a copy up there signed by him. So if you want to look at that afterwards, you can. But he was a great author, very successful author, a great hunter. One of my favorite things about him, because I love to hunt. For those of you, I don't know if anybody here is a hunter. Okay, we got a few. You've heard of the Boone and Crockett Society. He founded that. Great hunter. He was a great outdoorsman. As president, he expanded our national parks more than any other president. He contributed more. He dedicated more land to the national park system and the National Trust than all his prior presidents combined. He was very much a populist. He changed the way the U.S. government was involved in politics, in operating our country. He expanded regulation of meat and Medicine with the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. He mediated the anthracite coal settlement. He got involved in that. He actively fought against monopolies. He recognized that monopolies were not good for this nation, and even though he was a Republican and fought against a lot of the guys who put him in power, he knew it was good. He knew big corporations running the country was a bad idea. His administration filed 45 antitrust lawsuits while he was in office. So very much antitrust president. He was the first American ever to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Pretty great. He got that for negotiating peace between Russia and Japan in their war in 1905, I think, 1902, something like that, about that time. Anyway, so he got the Panama Canal built. Now today, when you fly from New York to LA in 3 hours or 4 hours, right, you don't think so much about the Panama Canal, but that was an incredible advancement for our nation, because with the East Coast and the West Coast, you could get commerce through the canal so much easier, and defense, the ships could go through. He was a big proponent of the Navy. He was at one point Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he sent what he called the Great White Fleet all around the world to project the power of the U.S. Navy and to let the world know that we were a world power. So Roosevelt, fabulous, fabulous president. So those are the 4 presidents that are on there. So now let's talk a little bit about, should anybody else be on there? Well, first of all, there have been 2 different attempts to have legislation passed to add people to the Mount Rushmore. Anybody want to guess who those 2 people were?
Reagan.
Reagan was one. Anybody know who the other one was?
Is it FDR?
Nope.
No.
What?
Susan B. Anthony.
Oh.
How about that? Women's suffrage, right? Neither of them made any traction.
I just was thinking presidents.
Well, FDR would be a great president to be on there. So there have been attempts, but it hasn't gone anywhere. What qualifications would you want if you were going to put somebody else on there? Well, first of all, you want somebody who's a great leader, right? Leadership. Because obviously you got to lead the nation, and all of these 4 men who are on there were incredible leaders, every one of them. You want integrity. You want people who are going to stand for what's right and do what's right no matter what the cost. And I got to give you one of my favorite stories about on this point. Teddy Roosevelt. In 1901, like I said, he was vice president. McKinley was assassinated. So he was first elected president in 1904. He was wildly popular. People loved Teddy Roosevelt. But after he was elected, he said he would honor the tradition of George Washington, and he would not run for a 3rd term. He regretted it almost instantly when he said it, and it haunted him throughout his 2nd term of presidency. And everybody wanted him to run a 3rd term because he could have so easily been elected. Everybody liked him. He was extraordinarily popular. So it would have been easy just to say, I'm running for a 3rd term, right? But listen to this. This is the kind of man he was. If I had accepted the nomination for president, my power for useful service would have forever been lessened, because nothing could have prevented the wide diffusion of the impression that I had not really meant what I said, that my actions did not really square with the highest and finest code of ethics. In other words, if you say you're going to do something, you do it. That's a man of integrity. Accomplishments, public and private sector. Every one of these men on Mount Rushmore had fabulous accomplishments, both in the public and private sector. So you look for that. And you look at someone who has had a permanent impact on the direction of our nation. So, if we're going to look at those 4 things, Then let's look at the presidents since 1925 when the legislation was passed and see if any of those would qualify, okay? Now, there's been a bunch of presidents that we're not gonna go through. There's too many to go through. So I've kind of picked out the 5 I would think would be the most likely of our presidents since 1925. FDR, 32nd president, 1933 to 1945. He was governor of New York before he was president. His legislative policies and government policies forever changed the direction of our nation. He passed the Glass-Steagall Act in 1933, which created the FDIC, which essentially saved our banking system. He passed the Social Security Act in 1935, which provided disability and retirement income for all Americans. He passed the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which created a national minimum wage and a 40-hour work week. If that wasn't enough, he saved Western civilization in World War II because he led the Allied coalition against Germany and Japan. He was our longest serving president. He was elected 4 terms. He didn't serve all 4 terms. He died shortly after being admitted on the 4th term, being sworn in. But he was the longest serving president, and after his death, led Congress to pass, and the American people to pass the 22nd Amendment, which says you can only run for 2 terms. So FDR, great president. Dwight Eisenhower, I've got something from Eisenhower here.
It's right in front.
Right there.
Yep.
Yeah, I've got something from Eisenhower. A great man, generally viewed as one of the top 10 presidents in the United States. Again, great military hero. He led the Allied coalition in World War II. He created the interstate highway system, which you might think, okay, so, well, think about this. Before him, there was no interstate highway system. Today, 25% of all vehicle miles driven are on the interstate highway system. So, huge impact there. His policies created tremendous economic prosperity. Personal income increased 45% while he was president. Personal wealth grew. He also was a huge champion of civil rights. During his presidency, the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and 1960 were both passed. And in 1954, while he was president, the Supreme Court handed down the opinion in Brown versus the Board of Education. Everybody knows what that is? Saying that separate of equal would not be an acceptable standard in education. Not a real popular decision all throughout the country at the time, but a good one. Well, Eisenhower took federal troops, sent them into Arkansas because he was going to enforce it. Huge champion of civil rights. He also started NASA during his term while he was president. Interesting side note about Eisenhower, he was the only president to be baptized a Christian while he was in office. Interesting, huh? And they changed the national motto was "In God We Trust" during his presidency. Okay, next, JFK, president from 1961 to 1963. He had the Camelot image, right? Marilyn Monroe, Frank Sinatra, the Rat Pack. Everybody loved JFK, but you know, potential doesn't get you on Mount Rushmore. But he was an extraordinarily popular president, and you don't know what would have happened had he not been assassinated, what his policy would have been. Could have had a tremendous impact upon the nation. Next, Ronald Reagan, governor of California before he was president. His accomplishments are huge. He ended the Cold War. All of you students here are post-Cold War students. But from 1945 to 1989, it was just this constant threat of war with Russia. In fact, I remember going to school in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis and getting on the school bus and thinking, okay, today we're going to have nuclear war. You know, they talk about how you did those drills where you get under your desk. I did those. This was a threat that we all lived under in this nation, and his policies essentially ended it. So he did that. incredible strong economy during his presidency, record good job creation, record wealth creation. He passed true tax reform with the tax code of 1986, which is still the tax code we're using today. So that is his legacy. Barack Obama, just president until 2017, first African American president. In my mind, you can't overemphasize the importance of that. Because if you think about the history of our nation and how we were so divided by the slavery issue and how we have been so haunted by it, to elect an African American president as the capstone of that civil rights movement is just huge. It's fabulous. What were his policies? Well, he did a lot of things. The economic stimulus after the 2008 recession, some of you might remember that, where we all thought the financial system in our country was about to collapse, passed stimulus packages and put them into place, which essentially got us through that. He passed Obamacare. You've all heard of Obamacare, right? Some people like it, some people don't, but it will forever change how health care is provided in our country. He had advanced social policies that were advanced social policies that impacted our nation. And we really don't know what his legacy is, but if there were ever to be somebody put on that mountain, you'd have to consider him. In my opinion, anyway, you'd have to. So, will anyone's face ever be added to Mount Rushmore? I know we did a little survey, some of you may have taken it. For what it's worth, the National Park Service, who administers and manages Mount Rushmore, has said it's not suitable for another face because you could damage the other faces. The adjacent rock may not be so strong. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. Maybe they just don't want to deal with the issue. I don't know. But the Park Service says you could never put another face up there. But it never stops the speculation. Never stops people from thinking it. Our current political climate, the division we have as a nation, I can't imagine it ever happening because I can't imagine the people in Washington agreeing on anything that big and that significant. Okay? One thing I do know is one president who I'm pretty sure will never be on it. Okay? Just a guess. Unless, of course, he issues an executive order, in which case he might make it. Hey, I hope you all have enjoyed this. Thank you all for coming out. She wanted to save 10 minutes for questions or whatever. I've got a lot of stuff up here you can come look at afterwards. Any questions?